I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it.
Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. The president, as you may have heard, fired back at the media today in New York after delivering a short speech on his proposal for a national infrastructure project. President Trump held a heated news conference where he defended his reaction to the street fighting and the car attack in Charlottesville, Virginia over the weekend. We'll get to what the president's remarks meant in just a minute, but first an update on them with Fox chief national correspondent Ed Henry.
Tucker, great to see you. President Trump being battered tonight by critics. CNN charging he went, quote, off the rails. And to be sure, suggesting there were fine people on both sides on Saturday when there were neo-Nazis and white supremacists there is going to be a problem for this president. But lost in the hysteria is that he did again very clearly denounce neo-Nazis. And he pointed out something liberals do not want to admit, that there was violence among some of the counter-protesters like Antifa. Watch.
What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
Let
me ask you this. What about the fact they came charging with clubs in their hands, swinging clubs? Do they have any problem? I think they do. So, as far as I'm concerned, that was a horrible, horrible day.
Then the media pushed the president again. Why didn't you initially call it terror on Saturday? The president could not have been clearer about how he felt about the person among those neo-Nazis who killed a woman with his car. Here's what he said.
I think the driver of the car is a disgrace to himself, his family, and this country. And that is, you can call it terrorism, you can call it murder, you can call it whatever you want.
Then, as it was pressed on whether he was putting radicals of the alt-left on the same moral plane as white supremacists, and while the president did, he was pressed about that, he made fair points about the danger of knocking down statues, erasing our history. He seemed to undo the positive nature of his statement yesterday at the White House when he clearly denounced neo-Nazis. He went back to what he was saying Saturday, that there was blame on both sides, and somehow added there were fine people on both sides, as he was asked about whether statues of Thomas Jefferson should come down next because he was a slave owner. Watch.
You're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
Treated unfairly, sir. I'm sorry, I just didn't understand what you were saying. You were saying the press has treated white nationalists unfairly?
No,
I just didn't understand what you were saying.
No. There were people in that rally, and I looked the night before. If you look, there were people protesting very quietly the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. I'm sure in that group there were some bad ones. The following day it looked like they had some rough, bad people, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them. But you had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest and very legally protest because, I don't know if you know, they had a permit. The other group didn't have a permit. So I only tell you this. There are two sides to a story. I thought what took place was a horrible moment for our country, a horrible moment. But there are two sides to the country.
Now, to take a step back, yesterday was going to be all about cracking down on China for unfair trade. Today was going to be all about infrastructure, the plan that the president thinks can create a lot of jobs. Very little of that message on either one of those big campaign promises is going to break through now. Tucker?
Thanks, Ed. One thing the president said today deserves more attention than it will likely get. Yesterday, a mob tore down a Civil War soldiers' memorial in Durham, North Carolina. Police stood idly by, and liberals across the country applauded it. Which statues are next, the president asked today? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson? It's not a joke. Suddenly, it's a serious question. Thomas Jefferson indisputably was a great man. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, and maybe most importantly, the greatest thinker in American political history. All of us live in his shadow. Unfortunately, however, Jefferson was also a slaveholder. That's real. It's a moral taint. We ought to remember it. But to the fanatics on the left, it means that Jefferson must be purged from public memory forever. The demands are already coming that we do that. In 2015, students at the University of Missouri demanded the removal of a Jefferson statue. 2 years ago on CNN, anchor Ashley Banfield suggested the Jefferson Memorial in Washington might have to go. Needless to say, there is literally no limit when you start thinking like this. Last year, hundreds of activists in New York demanded the statue of Theodore Roosevelt at the American Natural History Museum be dismantled. They argued that Roosevelt was a racist. If that's the standard, nobody is safe. Watch out, Abraham Lincoln, you're next. Now, to be clear, as if it's necessary, slavery is evil. If you believe in the rights of the individual, it's actually hard to think of anything worse than slavery. But let's be honest, up until 150 years ago, when a group of brave Americans fought and died to finally put an end to it, slavery was the rule rather than the exception around the world, and had been for thousands of years, sadly. Plato owned slaves. So did Muhammad, peace be upon him. Many African tribes held slaves and sold them. The Aztecs did too. Before he liberated Latin America, Simon Bolivar owned slaves. Slaveholding was so common among the North American Indians that the Cherokee brought their slaves with them on the Trail of Tears. And it wasn't something they learned from the European settlers. Indians were holding and trading slaves when Christopher Columbus arrived. And by the way, he owned slaves too. Now, none of this is a defense of the atrocity of human bondage. It is an atrocity. The point, however, is that if we're going to judge the past by the standards of the present, if we're going to reduce a person's life to the single worst thing he ever participated in, we had better be prepared for the consequences of that. And here's why. 41 of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence held slaves. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, had a plantation full of slaves. George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights, also owned slaves, unfortunately. But does that make what they wrote illegitimate? If these men were simply racist villains, and that's all they were, then the society they created is as evil as they were. There's no reason to respect its traditions or uphold its laws. The First Amendment, for example, the right to speak freely. For hundreds of years, Americans have revered it. Now the left dismisses it as the work of white supremacist slaveholders. It is worthless, they tell us. It must go. It is now routine to hear liberals claim that hate speech, whatever that is, isn't protected by the First Amendment, though, of course, the whole point of the First Amendment is to protect speech that offends people. It's a statement of shocking ignorance, and yet it is now common. CNN's Chris Cuomo said it. He's supposedly a lawyer. At Pomona College in California, students there are claiming that free speech is, quote, a tool appropriated by hegemonic institutions, whatever that means. They say the right of free expression should only apply to certain racial groups. But that's not racist because, as you know, there's no racism on the left. They're just sincere people concerned about hate. There's actually a vitally important debate going on in the country right now, and it's not about statues or even the alt-right and Antifa. It's about America's institutions and whether they are worth preserving. Radicals on the left want to tear it all down, as they did the statue in Durham yesterday. Equality under the law, protections for the individual against the mob, the absolute right to say and believe anything you choose. Those will be gone, replaced by something darker and more rigidly conformist. Is that a country you want to live in? If it's not, now's the time to speak up. Our elites are refusing to. They're too afraid. John Daniel Davidson is a senior correspondent at The Federalist, and he joins us tonight. John, this does seem like a turning point somehow, not just on the right but also on the left, these events of the last 2 days, and there seems to be a new intensity on the left. Am I imagining that?
No, you're not. And we do seem like we're at a turning point, but this has been coming down the pike for a number of years. I remember 2 years ago, we had the 150th anniversary of the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, and you had people in the mainstream media at that time calling for the desecration of Confederate graves, not just tearing down statues, but digging up remains, removing them, bulldozing over cemeteries. And this iconoclastic impulse is native to the left. This is what China's Cultural Revolution was all about. If you want to see where tearing down statues by mobs will get you, look at pictures of China's Cultural Revolution where they tore down statues, exactly right. Temples, the whole thing, even stomping on them.
But Mao did that, and the Khmer Rouge did that, And the Taliban did that in Afghanistan for political reasons. I mean, look, I'm not naturally, for whatever it's worth, not very sympathetic to the Confederacy. I'm an American, and I'm against insurrections, period. So, but it's not about that. The people who are attacking these statues know nothing about history. They don't know who Robert E. Lee was. They don't know who Stonewall Jackson was. They're trying to delegitimize the U.S. government and the traditions of American society because they don't believe in them. I mean, this is transactional. They're doing this to achieve a goal that has nothing to do with the Civil War.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of people on the right, conservatives on the right who are saying, yes, maybe we should move these statues to a museum, miss the point. This is not about the Confederacy. Exactly. This is not about the Civil War. This is about political power, and it's about a small group of people on the left trying to exert outsized influence on American politics by following in the footsteps of Mao, of the armed thugs in the Weimar Republic, of the Taliban. These are tactics that are well known. You start by tearing down statues and burning books, and eventually you go after people.
One of the ironies of all of this, and it's been interesting to watch on a split screen, left and right fighting each other, horrifying, but also instructive. One of the things I don't like about some of these white supremacist groups is that race is at the center of their worldview. And I don't want to live in a world where race is at the center of the worldview. But I see the same on the left. I see people with signs attacking white supremacy, or it's always about race for them as well. They seem every bit as race-obsessed and angry as the people they're fighting. But don't acknowledge that for some reason.
This is what happens with with identity politics. If you push identity politics, eventually you get around to identity politics for white people, which is a dangerous thing in a country that has a huge white majority. And this is why the left has been sowing these seeds of what's happening now for a long time. Are they surprised that eventually some white people are going to say, yeah, let's do identity politics, and we're going to have white identity politics? It's all poisonous garbage.
No, but this is the terminus. This is the end. What do you think happens when you force people to line up by their immutable characteristics, by race? You think you're not going to wind up with every group doing that? Of course you are. This is what identity politics looks like on left and right. Why does nobody make that point?
And it's totally un-American, too. America is not about ethnicity. It's not about national origin. It's about creed. And there's no place in the American constitutional system for identity politics, left or right. Plain and simple.
Thank you for saying that. You'll probably be attacked as something for doing so, but I'm glad you did. John, thank you.
Thanks.
Rioters in Durham, North Carolina destroyed a war memorial yesterday, and police simply stood by and watched it happen. Local governments are not keeping order in the streets for some reason. The chattering classes don't care. They're more concerned with rolling back free speech rights for the population than in protecting us from disorder. Why is that the case? We'll try to get to the bottom of it. Also, President Obama's biggest program for illegal immigrants turns 5 years old today. We've got a cake. We'll talk to a supporter of that program up ahead. Rioters in the city of Durham, North Carolina destroyed a statue honoring Confederate war dead. They pulled it down yesterday while cops stood by and did nothing. Well, you'd think the government allowing policy decisions to be made by mob violence would be a big concern among liberals. It's not a good precedent to set, but they don't seem bothered at all. Instead, a top priority on the left right now is securing a rollback of free speech rights for you and me. Yesterday on MSNBC, Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors said the First Amendment's protections don't apply to whatever is deemed to be hate speech.
We're seeing a movement of white nationalists rising up because they've been emboldened by Trump and his government. Hate speech, which is what we're seeing coming out of white nationalist groups, is not protected under the First Amendment rights.
Jasmine Kanik is a political commentator, and she joins us tonight. Jasmine, thanks for coming on. So,
thanks for having me.
Hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. You hear this a lot. Of course, hate speech is not mentioned in the Bill of Rights. There are a bunch of Supreme Court decisions, Brandenburg versus Ohio being, I think, the most important, that explain it very explicitly, yes, language you disagree with is covered by the First Amendment. But tell me where this idea comes from, because everybody seems to be repeating it.
Well, first of all, Patrisse Cullors is a good friend of mine, and I definitely understand what she's saying. Legally, is hate speech protected? Absolutely. Should it be? That depends on where you fall on the issue. When you're talking about white nationalism and white supremacists, yes, there is a lot of hate speech from that side. And she's absolutely right. When we talk about issues around Black lives and issues around equality, there isn't the hate that is coming from the other side. Let me put it to you that way.
Well, I guess that all kind of depends on what you think is hateful. I mean, look, let me just say really clearly, I'm against people hurting each other's feelings. I'm for politeness.
No, when you have the KKK and white folks talking about death to Black people, death to African Americans, calling people the N-word.
I agree completely.
That's hateful. No, it's not awful. That's hateful. That's a perfect example of hate speech.
It's absolutely hateful.
And you want to talk about
hold on, wait. So may I ask you a question? I mean, this is a pointless. This is actually kind of the point I was making. And I agree with everything you said. That is hateful and it's awful. I'm offended by it.
It is.
But really, what you're saying is you're offended. And that's the problem with hate speech, this fake category that we've made up all of a sudden, because it's entirely subjective. What's offensive to you or hateful to you may not be as offensive to me. We're both American citizens. We both live under the same Bill of Rights.
I agree.
You see the problem. So attempts by the left to ban speech are as bad as attempts by the right to ban speech. So why don't we just call a truce and stop trying to prevent people we disagree with from speaking?
No, I definitely agree with you on that point. It is a slippery slope when you start to try to define what is hateful and what is not. But it is really clear, especially given the images and the video that we saw coming out of Charlottesville, there was a lot of hate speech. There was a lot of hatefulness. And I think that a lot of Americans are really tired of it. I don't think it's just liberal Democrats. I think Americans, period, are very tired of the rhetoric on both sides. And when you talk about Charlottesville, for example, what I thought was really interesting was you had a lot of politicians coming out condemning it and calling for unity. And I remember saying to myself, you need to lead by example. There's a lot of hateful rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C. that Americans are watching every single day. And then you have instances like Charlottesville and what's going on around the country. People are angry. People are upset.
I agree. But hold on. We can't have that conversation or any conversation until we both agree that we have the right to say what we believe and that we're not going to be punished for doing that. And I see a lot of attempts on the left to shut down the conversation because they don't like what the other side is saying. And that is not the road to reconciliation or harmony. That's the road to division and war. Look, I don't think there are attempts by the right to shut to shut down people's speech. Name one.
Even on this very network. Come on now.
Name one. I can't. Are you kidding? Everyone with any point of view is allowed on my show. In fact, welcomed on my show. Let me ask you a question, since we're talking about the events the last couple of days. So, left-wing protesters are upset by the existence of Civil War memorials, Robert E. Lee statues, because they're symbols of racial discrimination and hate. If you knew that there were 50 public buildings paid for by taxpayers, maintained by taxpayers in this country, named after a Ku Klux Klan recruiter, would that bother you?
Look, there are buildings in Los Angeles. There was a building in Los Angeles named after one of the most racist police chiefs of the Los Angeles Police Department.
No, there's no comparison. Hold on. This is not a racist police chief. This is the exalted cyclops of the KKK, Robert Byrd, the longest-serving U.S. senator who just died several years ago. Why is there no effort to take his name off these buildings? As a former Klan recruiter, you'd think people would be offended by his name.
I think you need to give it time. But I think one of the issues is that you can take down all of the monuments, you can change the names of a lot of buildings, but you can't change American history. And I think that's part of what's missing from this conversation. Do I want to see monuments and statues of people who were racist or supported slavery? Not really, but at the same time, I don't completely want to erase American history either, because I want to make sure future generations know what happened. And I think we're in this cycle right now. We're in such a rush to get rid of things that remind us of bad times in our history, and it's like, yeah, it was bad, but you know what? We also have to remember what happened and pass that down in hopes of not repeating it as well.
Well, I think that's right, and also the United States ended slavery around the world, and maybe we should get some credit for that too, don't you think? Okay, we're out of time.
Yeah.
Think about that, Jasmine. Thanks for coming on tonight.
We can't even get Americans to talk about reparations, so no, thank you.
Yeah, I think we deserve some credit. Well, the War Memorial in Durham was destroyed. Police did nothing to stop protesters or the people who pulled it off the pedestal. Didn't even bother to arrest the head vandals. Up next, we'll talk to 2 law enforcement veterans about why police are tolerating destruction in the public square. Stay tuned.